The history of Native Americans following European colonization is a tale of systemic violence, cultural erasure, and survival against all odds. The arrival of European settlers in North America marked the beginning of a devastating chapter for the indigenous peoples who had thrived there for millennia. Misguided by greed, imperialism, and racial superiority, the settlers and their governments systematically dismantled native societies through deception, war, disease, and forced assimilation. Despite centuries of suffering, Native Americans have demonstrated extraordinary resilience, preserving their cultural identities and continuing to fight for justice and recognition. This essay delves into the dark history of Native Americans post-European colonization, offering insights into the atrocities they endured, their ongoing struggles, and the enduring strength of their spirit. Before the arrival of Europeans, North America was home to a vast tapestry of indigenous civilizations. Historians estimate that as many as 50 million Native Americans lived across the Americas, with up to 10 million in what is now the United States. These communities were highly diverse, with over 600 distinct tribes speaking hundreds of languages. They thrived in harmony with the land, cultivating crops such as corn, beans, and squash, and developing complex governance systems, trade networks, and spiritual practices. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, is credited with influencing the U.S. Constitution, showcasing the sophistication of indigenous political systems. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built intricate cliff dwellings and irrigation systems, while the Mississippian culture in the Midwest constructed monumental earthworks like Cahokia, a city of 20,000 people near modern-day St. Louis. These societies flourished for thousands of years, but their stability was shattered by the arrival of Europeans in 1492. The encounter between Native Americans and European settlers began with a veneer of diplomacy, but quickly descended into violence and exploitation. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he misidentified the inhabitants as Indians, setting the stage for centuries of misunderstanding and dehumanization. Initially, Europeans presented gifts and sought trade, but these overtures often masked their intentions of conquest. The most devastating weapon Europeans brought with them was not their guns or swords, but diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Native Americans, having no immunity to these foreign pathogens, suffered catastrophic population declines. In some regions, entire communities were wiped out within a generation. Estimates suggest that diseases alone killed up to 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas, making this one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The loss of life disrupted native societies, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation and invasion. This biological catastrophe was compounded by deliberate acts of violence as European settlers began seizing land and resources. From the 1600s through the 1800s, European settlers engaged in over 1,500 documented violent attacks on native communities. These ranged from small-scale skirmishes to large-scale massacres, often justified by the settlers' belief in their racial and cultural superiority. One of the earliest and most brutal examples was the Pequot War, from 1636 to 1638 in New England. English settlers and their native allies attacked Pequot villages, killing hundreds and selling survivors into slavery. The war culminated in the Mystic Massacre, where English forces burned a Pequot village to the ground, killing nearly 700 men, women, and children. In the 19th century, the U.S. government escalated its campaign against Native Americans, often violating treaties and employing military force to drive tribes off their lands. The Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 exemplifies this brutality. In Colorado, U.S. soldiers attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village, killing over 200 people, mostly women and children. Survivors recounted horrifying atrocities, including mutilations and the desecration of corpses. The culmination of these violent campaigns came at Wounded Knee in 1890, where U.S. troops killed over 250 Lakota Sioux, including women and children, during a crackdown on the Ghost Dance movement. This massacre marked the end of the Indian Wars, but left a legacy of trauma and loss for native communities. By the late 18th century, the U.S. government had adopted a systematic approach to dispossessing Native Americans of their lands. Treaties were signed under duress, often with false promises of protection or compensation. Between 1778 and 1871, The US signed over 500 treaties with native tribes, nearly all of which were violated. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, was one of the most egregious examples of legislative oppression. This law authorized the forced relocation of native tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. The most infamous result was the Trail of Tears, during which the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw peoples were forcibly marched hundreds of miles. Thousands died from exposure, disease, and starvation along the way. By the late 19th century, the Dawes Act of 1887 further eroded native land holdings by dividing communal lands into individual allotments, which were often sold to white settlers. By 1900, Native Americans had lost 98% of their original lands, leaving many tribes impoverished and displaced. The US government and white society viewed native cultures as obstacles to progress. Policies of forced assimilation aimed to erase indigenous identities and integrate Native Americans into mainstream society. One of the most insidious tools of this cultural genocide was the establishment of Indian boarding schools in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. At schools like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, native children were stripped of their languages, traditions, and names. They were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their religions and were often subjected to physical and psychological abuse. The motto of these institutions, "Kill the Indian, save the man," epitomized their destructive mission. The Civilization Fund Act of 1819 provided funding for these schools, further institutionalizing cultural erasure. The trauma inflicted on generations of native children continues to affect their descendants today. For centuries, the United States government and society have whitewashed the history of Native Americans, portraying a false narrative of harmony and progress. School textbooks and popular culture often romanticize the westward expansion of settlers, framing Native Americans as either noble savages or obstacles to civilization. This distorted narrative perpetuates harmful stereotypes and obscures the realities of colonization. For example, the myth of Thanksgiving celebrates a supposed moment of unity between Pilgrims and Native Americans, ignoring the subsequent violence and betrayal faced by tribes like the Wampanoag. The traumatic legacy of colonization persists in Native American communities today. Many tribes face extreme poverty, with unemployment rates far higher than the national average. According to the United States Census Bureau, nearly 25% of Native Americans live below the poverty line. Health disparities are also rampant. Native Americans have higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, and substance abuse compared to other populations. Life expectancy for Native Americans is significantly lower, reflecting the systemic neglect of their communities. Political representation remains minimal, with Native voices often excluded from decision-making processes. Despite having sovereign tribal governments, Native Americans frequently struggle to assert their rights and protect their lands from exploitation. Despite centuries of oppression, Native Americans have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Movements like the American Indian movement in the 1960s and 1970s brought attention to issues of sovereignty, civil rights, and cultural preservation. In recent years, protests against projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline have highlighted the ongoing struggle to protect sacred lands and resources. Efforts to revitalize native languages and traditions are also gaining momentum as tribes work to reclaim their cultural identities. Tribal colleges and cultural programs are fostering a new generation of leaders who are deeply rooted in their heritage. The history of Native Americans post-European colonization is a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of imperialism, greed, and systemic oppression. Acknowledging this history is essential for fostering reconciliation and justice. While the wounds of the past cannot be undone, steps can be taken to address ongoing inequalities and support Native communities in preserving their cultures and achieving self-determination. The resilience of Native Americans in the face of centuries of adversity stands as a testament to their enduring strength and the profound depth of their cultural heritage. While much has been lost, lands, languages, lives, and traditions, their spirit remains unbroken. Today, Native Americans are reclaiming their narratives, pushing back against the whitewashing of history, and fighting for the recognition of their rights as sovereign nations. Efforts to restore sacred lands, revitalize indigenous languages, and create spaces for cultural expression and political representation are a vital part of this resurgence. Programs aimed at education, healthcare, and economic development, led by both native and non-native allies, offer a pathway toward healing and progress. As a society, understanding and reckoning with this dark chapter of history is not merely an act of justice for Native Americans. It is essential for the moral integrity of the United States as a nation. The land that now constitutes the United States was built on the backs of displaced and devastated indigenous peoples. Recognizing their contributions, suffering, and continued resilience is necessary to move forward as a more inclusive and equitable society. In the end, the story of Native Americans is not just one of tragedy. It is also one of profound survival and hope. Their voices, which have been silenced for far too long, are now rising, reminding us of the importance of respect for all cultures and the critical need to protect the rights and dignity of indigenous peoples worldwide. By confronting the past honestly and working together to address its legacy, we can build a future that honors Native American heritage and ensures their communities thrive for generations to come. This journey of understanding and reconciliation is not just a tribute to the resilience of Native Americans, but a call to action for all who value justice and humanity. Let this history serve as both a lesson and an inspiration, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never repeated, and that the future is built on the foundation of equity, respect, and shared prosperity.